Hi everyone. Do you want me to use the microphone? Yeah, okay. Laura said we'll do it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No problem. All right, hi everybody. Thanks Emily for the introduction. Emily said I'm Jenny Park. I've been working at International Student Scholar Services here at Illinois for about 9 years. So you can say I'm an expert, but as everyone knows, the immigration laws and regulations are always changing, so I'm an expert as much as one can be, I suppose. So today we're going to talk about hiring international students, which is something that brings a lot of people a lot of pause and a lot of sort of anxiety because of those immigration regulations, right? But honestly, it's not so bad. I tailored this presentation to cover things that are specific to employers. So the things that those of you who are employers here in Research Park need to know when hiring international students, kind of a little bit less about what the students need to do and a little bit more about what the requirements are for you as employers. So I will go into some details about the student process and what's expected of students. So that said, the objectives today will kind of review the different immigration statuses held by international students at Illinois. Our office specifically advises on really 2 of those statuses, and the rest are sort of not sponsored by Illinois, and therefore we don't really advise on them, but I will kind of cover them in a little bit of detail, not very much. Then we'll talk about the different work authorizations that are available to the students that we do sponsor and we do advise on. We'll cover kind of the basic information about requirements and processes for those work authorization applications, though again, since most of those do not involve employers, I won't go into kind of excruciating detail about them, though there are resources on our website where you can find that information if you so please. And then there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. So if you have questions as I go, feel free to interrupt me, and I can address them as we move through. If you prefer to save your questions to the end, that is also fine. And I'll stick around at the end too if you have kind of more specific questions that you want to address one-on-one. So like I mentioned, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the different work authorizations and the processes for students to apply, but if you are interested, this is the page on our website on employment, and it has information about all the different authorizations available to our F1 and J1 students. Specifically the 3 that are marked with arrows, F1 CPT, F1 OPT, and the F1 OPT extension. Those all have pre-recorded workshop videos that explain the process, the documentation, everything that needs to be done in order to apply for those. So if you're interested, please feel free to explore those pages and watch those workshops. So as far as the common immigration statuses at Illinois for students sponsors students in 2 different statuses, which is the F1 student status and the J1 exchange visitor student status. The F1 status is a student status, like I mentioned. It's regulated by the Department of Homeland Security. The document that these students hold is called an I-20. So that's the document that basically indicates if they're in status, if they are in F1 status, what their dates are, their field of study, all of that. These students are eligible for on and off-campus work authorizations, and they make up about 90% of our international student population. And they're degree-seeking students, I should also mention. The J1 exchange visitor status is an interesting one. It's divided into something like 18 or 20 categories. One of them is a degree-seeking student or university student category. There's also a short-term scholar category, research professor category, au pair category, physician category. Those our office specifically doesn't work with, at least the student branch of our office. But we specifically work with J1 exchange visitors in the university student category. This status is regulated by the Department of State. The document that these students hold is a DS 2019. So similar to the I-20, just looks different and kind of more outdated. They're also eligible for certain on and off-campus work authorizations, and they make up about 8% of our international student population. Our J1 exchange visitors are typically our exchange students, though we do have some degree-seeking students. The difference there is that with J1 exchange visitors, typically more than 50% of their funding has to come from a non-personal source, so we usually see those as our master's and PhD students with assistantships, because then they're getting the majority of their funding from their assistantship from the university, whereas the majority of our undergraduate students are F1 students, because a lot of their funding is coming from, you know, mom and dad or something like that. There are some exceptions, students with specific government scholarships and things of that sort. But that's where we see the majority of our J1 students. And then we have about 2% of our students come from kind of various potpourri categories. And those statuses are, the ones that we usually see are H4, L2, E2, and J2. They're mostly dependent categories, or dependent statuses. So the H4 is a dependent of an H1, L2 of an L1, J2 of J1. So these are individuals who are here accompanying someone in a primary status. There are some students here who are in their own primary status, like we do have some H1 students, we do have some G4 students, government employees, but those are more rare situations because their statuses, their primary activity is something that's not studied, right? So it's like some kind of work and their employers allowing them to study. These statuses, like I mentioned, we don't sponsor for the most part, with the exception of some of the J2s, who are dependents of J1 students here, and some of the H4s who are dependents of some of our H1s, because the University of Illinois does sponsor certain H1s, I'm sure you're aware. So our office typically does not offer advice or advising to these students on the documentation or work authorizations for their statuses. They would need to talk to their sponsor of the primary's status in order to get more information about those. We can give kind of basic information, but for more detailed information about the work authorization that they're eligible for, they would have to talk to their own sponsor. So that's kind of an overview of the different immigration statuses that we see most regularly. So we'll start, since the majority of our students are F1 students, we'll start with the F1 work authorizations. The first one is F1 on-campus work authorization. So in order for work to qualify as on-campus for F1 students, it has to meet one or more of these three criteria. One, it has to be physically on premises. Two, it has to be paid by the university. Or three, it has to provide a direct service to students. So on premises is easy, it's in a campus building. So it would have to be like in the union or an assistantship in a department, something like that. Paid by the university is one that's very common to Research Park. Those Office of Corporate Relations agreements whereby the student works at an entity that is not the University of Illinois but is paid through the University of Illinois. And direct service to students is usually students who are working, like, say, in a private certified housing. And so it's not a campus-owned building, they're not being paid by the university, but if there were no students, they would have no job. So students often ask about that one with regard to like restaurants on Green Street, but if there are no students, like in the summer, we still go to Green Street, so it doesn't qualify. Anyway, so F1 on-campus work authorization specifically for Research Park is allowed again if the company has that agreement with the Office of Corporate Relations and the student is thereby paid through OCR. Students can work up to 30 days before their program start date in on-campus employment for F1s, and they don't need any prior authorization. They just can start working. Their total on-campus employment is limited to 20 hours per week during the academic year. So if they have an assistantship and they're working for you, their total employment can't exceed 20 hours per week unless it's an official school break, so fall break, winter break, spring break, and summer, as long as it's not their first or last semester, then they can work over 20 hours per week. Like I said, they don't need any additional paperwork, they can just start working. And on-campus work does qualify them to apply for a social security number. In order to be eligible in general for a social security number, the students have to be working or have a job offer that starts in the next 30 days.
Yeah. That 20 hours per week max, who's in charge of monitoring that?
We are sort of with, together with academic human resources. So we get it, that's a good question. We get a report from AHR every 2 weeks of any students who have exceeded or appear to have exceeded that limit. So for example, the student has a 25% assistantship and is working 10 hours per week in their assistantship, and then they have an hourly job at Research Park, and they're supposed to be working just 10 hours per week, but they work 13, we'll get notified, and then we'll follow up with the student accordingly. Most of the time it's data entry errors. In some cases there are actual violations, and work violations are very serious. Typically, our process is if a student does have a violation, they get a warning the first time, and the second violation is a termination of their status, which is not easy to come back from, but possible.
If any of you are wondering what is this OCR agreement thing, just talk to Emily or I, and we can tell you all about it. There is overhead for that program, and we can walk you through it and connect you with our colleagues at OCR who do run it. So many of our company, about a third of the student interns in the Research Park are paid that way, in case you're wondering what the numbers are.
Yeah.
So there is a time card like system that if you're going to have an intern or someone working for you, you have to supervise entry into the time card system.
If it's on-campus employment, then it would. I don't know how it works with OCR, how they monitor, because that goes through them, the hours, because it's university employment. But I'm sure that Laura or Emily would be able to address that.
Can you repeat this question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, that there's, the company needs to do time card entry or monitor the number of hours that are worked by the students so that they get reported properly to the university. Yeah, of course.
And frankly, that's an issue actually for any student worker. So there's limitations for any student that's working on campus, and they are paid by the university how many hours they can work because they are supposed to be a full-time student. So just FYI, that's not a limit, and actually the OCR program does not distinguish between international or domestic students. It's just students.
So for on-campus employment, the only employer requirements, if it's a Research Park employer, is that you have the agreement with OCR and that there's an offer letter. An offer letter is really only if the student is going to be applying for the social security number, but also for their records. It's nice to have, and just good practice. But those are really the only requirements. So besides the OCR agreement, it's really the same as any hire. Any questions? That's on-campus employment for F1 students. Does anyone have any other questions about that before I move on to the next type of authorization?
So this is for active students, so does like recent graduates also like this?
So this is a good question. On-campus employment is just for current active enrolled students. This next one that I'll talk about as well is also just for active enrolled students. There is another type that I'll talk about in a little bit. So on-campus authorization and curricular practical training are for current students. Optional practical training is for students who have graduated.
So Jenny, I know that we can continue to employ students as students once they graduate, but basically only for that summer after their graduation. Do you know if this applies to those students as well?
No, it wouldn't apply. So that's a good question. So for on-campus employment specifically, the last day that a student can work, an international student can work in on-campus employment is the end date on their I-20 or BS 2019. And I have some examples of those documents also in the presentation, so I can show you where to look for those dates, or where your HR would be looking for those dates when working on the I-9 stuff. So yeah, so on campus would be just for current enrolled students. The next type of work authorization we'll talk about is curricular practical training, or CPT, which is temporary off-campus employment authorization. That's for a student to use during their program of study. It has to be during their program of study. It cannot be before or after. They're usually internships, co-ops, things of that sort. And these are usually done at Research Park for companies that do not have those OCR agreements. Or if a student wants to work more than 20 hours per week during a required semester with your company. This authorization does need to be done before the student starts work, and it's granted by our office, and our processing time is about 5 business days. So the student would have to put in their application with us. It needs to be approved by their department. They confirm basically that it is curricular in nature, the employment that they're going to be pursuing, and then our office approves it and issues them a new I-20 that shows that they've been approved for the CPT. The application is submitted online to our office, so it's pretty simple and straightforward, and CPT can be either part-time or full-time. Part-time being up to 20 hours per week, and full-time being over 20 hours per week. A few notes on CPT. Student can't start CPT without getting that prior authorization and having the updated I-20 with the CPT authorization in the end. And they're only authorized to work for the company listed on the I-20 and the dates listed on the I-20. So if they want to work for multiple companies, it's multiple requests, and there'll be multiple employers and dates listed. And then the other thing is CPT can't be backdated. So if you're looking to hire an international student through CPT, you want to make sure that you give them enough lead time between offer and proposed start date to get the paperwork done. Because if you give them an offer and they're real excited to have them, you want to start tomorrow, it's not going to happen. Unless we're really powering through our documents fast. So it does happen, but I don't want to promise that. So can't be backdated. The system will physically not let us push them past it. So that's really important to remember. The CPT also, to prove sort of that curricular connection, does require course registration. This is something the student will need to manage with their department, but it's just for your information. It's usually an internship course or a thesis research course if the work they're doing with you is directly related to their thesis. Also, our authorization, we can only authorize for a year at a time. We can extend past that, but it's just each authorization is 1 year maximum at a time. And there is also a limit on full-time CPT. So if a student is doing part-time CPT, they can do as much of that as they want during their degree program. But for full-time CPT, they're limited to 364 days. So if they do 12 months or 365 days of full-time CPT during a degree level, they lose all of their OPT or post-graduation work authorization for that level. This is something that students need to keep track of, but something good for you to know. If you really love working with a student and want them to keep working with you, you might want to cut them back to part-time so they don't lose the opportunity to work with you after they graduate. Another thing I wanted to mention is for part-time CPT. If they're authorized for part-time CPT during a required semester, so fall or spring, or summer if it's their last semester, then their total employment cannot exceed 20 hours per week. So if they have any on-campus employment, that on-campus employment plus the employment they're doing in their CPT cannot exceed 20 hours per week if it's part-time CPT. If it's full-time, you got more flexibility. Another thing to mention with CPT is that a student can't typically start CPT immediately. They have to complete a full year of full-time studies before they're eligible. So that's another sort of difficult thing sometimes if someone comes and they want to start right away. There are a couple of exceptions. The one that we see most often is someone who's pursued a previous degree at a U.S. institution and transferred here, then they may be immediately eligible. But typically, they have to wait until, it's usually, they start in the fall and they have to wait until the following summer to start their CPT.
Is that a time when you can use the on-campus employment here at the research park?
For sure, yeah. So a lot of students, that's a good question, because a lot of students will do that. If the companies have that OCR agreement, they'll start as on campus because that can start immediately. And then they'll use their CPT for something outside of Research Park in that case, once they're eligible for it. As far as CPT employer requirements, the only real requirement is that in order to approve, we have to have a letter, an offer letter on letterhead, and that's it. Otherwise, everything else is on the student to do the application online. The paperwork for HR is, a little bit different, right? Because the I-9 documents you're asking for are a little bit different, but the only true requirement that we need from an immigration perspective is a letter on letterhead from the employer. I'm assuming it needs more stuff from you all just. All right, so this is the sample. It's probably kind of hard to read, but you can maybe see in the second box that has all of those circles, those are where you'll find the dates that the student is eligible to work, basically, their program dates. Program start date, again, student can start working on campus up to 30 days before that, and the program end date is the last day for the on-campus work. For CPT, it just has to be in those dates, and we'll check that, so that you don't need to worry about. And then on page 2 is where you'll see the actual CPT authorization. So here you see it says Google and has the dates for the CPT authorization. This I-20 also has a sample OPT authorization, but you don't need to worry about that. That won't necessarily be there from CPT. All right, any questions about CPT? All right, so the next work authorization for F1 students that we'll talk about is optional practical training, or OPT. So OPT is up to 12 months of work authorization that's most commonly used by students after graduation. The application is adjudicated by the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, which means that unlike CPT, where the processing time is 5 business days, the average processing time for USCIS, government entity, is about 90 business days. Or sorry, 90 days, sorry. It's 90 days. We have been seeing them get processed a lot quicker recently. I had a student recently who got their OPT approved in about 2 weeks. But this is very strange, and we definitely don't guarantee that, because that's usually not the way it goes. The application does start with a request for a new I-20 from our office, because the USCIS requires that the sponsoring institution recommends the student for OPT, basically confirming that they've met all of their requirements for us. There's also a 1-year requirement for OPT, much like CPT. They have to complete a full year of full-time studies before they're eligible. They have to have complied with all registration requirements for any previous CPT that they've done. Like I mentioned, they have to be registered for courses for CPT. So we check to make sure they've done that. We check to make sure they've met the 1-year requirement, all of that. And then we issue an I-20 that says that they're recommended for OPT. That application, the student files to USCIS either by post or online. Again, it takes about 90 days to process. OPT is available once per education level, per ascending education level. So a student could potentially do a bachelor's degree, 12 months of OPT, a master's degree, 12 months of OPT, and then a PhD, and another 12 months of OPT. So they could get a good amount of work authorization using OPT. In order to start work on OPT, the start date is going to be after they graduate, typically in the 60 days after they finish their program. So for students finishing this May, the program end date is either May 13th or May 15th, depending on a couple of things. So their OPT start date is going to be somewhere between mid-May and mid-July. It's important that before they start work, they have to have their EAD card in hand. Their EAD card is proof that their OPT has been approved. It's their employment authorization document, and that should come in the post about 90 days after within hopefully 90 days after they apply for their OPT. And they do have to have that card in hand, and the start date has to arrive. So like my student who got their card after 2 weeks, they still have a start date of like June 1st for their OPT. So even though they have the card in hand, they can't start working until the start date on the card arrives. Few notes on OPT. Employment on OPT has to meet certain criteria, and those are that the work that they're doing, the student is doing, has to be directly related to their field field of study, has to be at least 20 hours per week, and it has to be commensurate with their degree level. This we usually say for students who are intending to work on campus, because they can't hold student employment. It's no longer appropriate, it's not commensurate with their degree, because they completed the degree during which they were doing the student employment. Students will often ask how they know if a job is directly related to their field. We typically advise that they speak with their academic advisor, someone in their department who is familiar with their program, but that is the responsibility of the student to be able to explain that relationship. When we are updating their I-20 to reflect their employers during their OPT period, we ask them for a brief description of how the work is related to their field, because we need to put that into the Student Exchange Visitor Information System, or SEVIS. But we don't necessarily scrutinize that, because I am certainly not, an expert in biomedical engineering, right? So that's not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of the student, and we tell them that, but they will often have questions. So if they ask you, please feel free to direct them to their department for guidance on whether or not the work is directly related. When it does become really important to be able to prove that relationship is if the student is applying for future benefits, so an H-1B status or a green card or something like that, when their past work authorization is scrutinized a bit more. It has also come up when students are applying for the extension, the STEM extension of the OPT. We've had students get requests for evidence to ask for proof that what they were doing during their initial OPT period was directly related to their field of study. So it does come up, and students have been asked for that proof. Yeah.
You mentioned that they would have to submit evidence. Could you give us examples for what that might look like?
Yeah, of course. So in the past, it really depends on the RFE, the request for evidence that they're sent. Sometimes it's transcripts with the courses, sometimes it's transcripts and the job description, showing the connection between like what they studied, like course A and like job responsibility B or whatever. So it does vary though, and usually the request for evidence will kind of explain or itemize like what they should be sending in. Again, this is not with every application, but it's something that we have been seeing, especially with a lot of the fields of study or the majors and the programs at the university that have become STEM fields that have been approved by the Board of Higher Education in Illinois to be STEM fields. Because with a lot of these programs, the name that's on the diploma doesn't always match the name that's on the I-20, because the university name is a little bit different than the SEVIS name, and so sometimes there are questions about that. In those cases, departments that have these programs are typically aware of that, and usually have letters that the students can submit with their request for evidence. But that's, again, not a super common thing that happens. But it can, so if it comes up, it's nothing to really worry too much about, but the students do have to comply with those requests for evidence by the deadline. Yeah.
So, I just want to make sure, so OPT is just for when they graduate, right, after graduation?
It's most common after graduation.
I have some students that are not after this OPT, and they're not graduating, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, so OPT is most commonly used after graduation. There is something called pre-completion OPT, which is for students to use before they graduate. This was much more common, like when I started at the university, in certain programs that didn't have internship courses, because then they didn't have an option for CPT. So like economics, only in I think 2014 or 15 introduced their internship course. Before that, all of those, econ students always do internships, right? And so they didn't have an option for CPT because they had no internship course, so they had to do pre-completion OPT. The problem with pre-completion OPT is that the application for it is much like post-completion OPT, where they have to apply 90 days before, and it also takes away from their post-completion OPT. So that 12 months is for all the OPT they're doing during that summer to do an internship. They only have 9 months after they graduate to work. So that's, there's a lot of downsides to it, but we have had a couple of students who companies will say that they don't sponsor students on CPT and force them basically to do pre-completion OPT. So I've got some opinions on it, but we won't get into
And
it.
then just another one. So what I've heard from them also about OPT, I think the process for that is a bit longer than the CPT, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so the OPT process, since it is, those applications are adjudicated by USCIS and not entirely in our office like CPT.
That's right.
There's a lot more paperwork involved, there's a lot more cost involved, because there's a filing fee to USCIS. We also have an OPT management fee in our office, that's $100 basically per year of OPT. Because once a student graduates, they no longer pay the international student fee, but we still are supporting them fully through their OPT and STEM periods. So for that reason, there's a management fee that we charge. But the real difficult fee is the $410 for the.
They always ask me, do you think the company will reimburse us for it? So,
Oh, okay, yeah. And that's up to you. That's absolutely nothing. There's no requirement for OPT. The company have anything to do with paying those fees. Employer requirements, none. The student has an EAD card, they can start working. Again, the I-9 paperwork is a little bit different than domestic student, but for all intents and purposes, there is no additional work that the employer has to do for the student's initial period of OPT. OPT is also just a kind of a blanket authorization. A student does not have to have a job offer like CPT to apply. So they can just apply for the authorization and then find a job afterwards. So this one is probably the easiest on employers, I'd say.
and the clock is basically ticking, right?
But yeah, that's exactly right. If you want them for longer than a year, if they are in a STEM field, then we'll talk about the STEM extension in a second. But if they're not, then the clock is really ticking to look for an H or something like that.
I was gonna say that the students are really reluctant to use this, and they want to use it kind of in an emergency situation, in my experience.
Oh, okay. Yeah, some students, some students will use it. It's sort of like it bridges the gap for students who are expecting to get an H but don't want to chance it on the lottery and maybe they'll have their work authorization. A thing to bridge the gap, or a safety net, especially with the STEM extension as a safety net in case their H doesn't get approved. So that's the STEM also gives them multiple chances to apply for the H. So we do see students do that, but that's interesting to hear that they're wary of the clock. All right, any other questions on OPT? I just had a sample EAD card here. Just, for your information and some levity. Important things to note here are the OPT dates. Those are the only dates that the student is authorized to work for. And then the category, if it's post-completion OPT, will be the CO3B. That's post-completion. Under the terms and conditions on this one, it says post-completion OPT. It doesn't always say that, and it's okay if it doesn't, as long as the category is there. So that's just, something to keep in mind. We did have a lot of students who were panicked and they stopped putting in those terms and conditions. But yeah, as long as the category is correct, that's really all you need to worry about. Alright, so the F1 OPT STEM extension. So for students in science, technology, engineering, and math, they're eligible for a 24-month extension of their initial OPT. They are eligible for 2 of these per lifetime, so if they do 2 different STEM degrees, they can have 2 OPT STEM extensions. They cannot back those up, so they can't do a bachelor's in civil engineering, a master's in civil engineering, and then do OPT for a year and then 2 STEM extensions. You can't do that. It has to be, each STEM extension has to be tacked on to an initial period of OPT. So they could do a bachelor's in civil, OPT STEM extension, a master's in civil, OPT STEM extension, but you can't double down on the STEM extensions together. The application period for the STEM extension is the last 90 days of the initial OPT, and this authorization is also granted by USCIS. So it's again the full application process, very similar to the initial OPT process with a few extra documents. Processing time average 90 days. And the student will get an ADP card that will show the extra 2 years.
So does it mean typically there will be a period of time when the student can't work?
Great question. So no, typically no. Because if a student applies during their application period, so during that 90 days, they are allowed to continue working for up to 180 days after their OPT period ends, as long as they have a timely filed pending STEM application. So great question. So usually, unless processing times are absolutely ridiculous, they should be able to continue working seamlessly between their OPT and their STEM extension.
Just to follow up on that, because I've been told differently by the ISS, because,
Too many S's.
yeah.
Sorry.
Because when I asked them about like the 180 days, they said it depends on like depends on something. So could you confirm that there's like no other factors affecting that 180-day, kind of?
Yeah, if you're moving from OPT to STEM, I can confirm you have 180 days as long as you have a timely filed, so filed in that 90 day, like last 90 days of your OPT, and the start of the, like when the STEM extension gets approved. As long as it's within those 180 days, you can keep working. Now, there are some employers that don't really like that, or if you start with a new employer, sometimes they don't like it because you don't have an active EAD card. Some of them want to see, you know, the I-797 approval, or, receipt notice, for the STEM application. But in theory, you should be able, or students should be able to continue working seamlessly for that 180 days as long as that application is filed. I'm racking my brain. There's really no exceptions there. So those are the basics on the STEM extension. As far as STEM employer requirements, they are numerous. So a few years ago, the rules for STEM changed. Those of you who were around in pre-2016, it used to be a 17-month extension. There really wasn't very much oversight. And then Department of Homeland Security was like, we need paperwork. So they added all sorts of requirements. The E-Verify requirement was previously a requirement. So any student or any company that a student is working for on the STEM extension has to be E-Verified. The employment must also be paid on STEM extension. On OPT, it can be unpaid, though I don't think that's really probably an issue for you all. The employer, together with the student, must complete what's called an I-983 training plan, which is basically an outline of what the student's goals, objectives, tasks, responsibilities are during STEM extension training. The I-983 has to be signed, and it has to be, there are evaluations that need to take place, and those evaluations also have to be signed by the employer. And the employer working through a staffing agency at another company is typically not allowed, because the company that's completing the I-9 and has hired you, you're not actually working for them, it's a staffing company. So that's also a difference. OPT, that's the first year of OPT, that's fine. STEM extension, not so much. Any questions about those requirements? If you wanted to see the training plan, I didn't put it up because it's 6 pages long, 5 pages of information in fine print. But I did pull up the link for you, and we can do a QR code for easy access. Again, it has to be completed together with the student, and it is required in order to request the I-20 with recommendation for the STEM extension. It is kept on file with our office and not sent to USCIS. So it's their form, but they want us to house it. So make it make sense. The participation report, so on STEM extension, a student is responsible for submitting a participation report every 6 months after the start of their STEM extension. At the 6 and 18 month marks, they only have to submit a form to us through iStart confirming where they're working. so that we can make sure that the details that we have on file match what they're actually doing. So at the 6 and 18 month marks, the employer doesn't need to do anything. It's only at 12/24 and anytime a student leaves your employee during their STEM extension period that you need to do something. And those are the self-evaluation and final evaluation on the very last page of the I-983. So this is the final page of the I-983 that has on the top is the evaluation of student progress. So that's the self-evaluation that the student will fill out at the 12-month mark and company signatory authority will need to sign off on. The bottom section is the final evaluation on student progress, which needs to be filled out at the 24-month mark of the STEM extension. And again, also at any time that the student leaves employment with an employer while on STEM. This would also hold true if a student is on STEM and starts their H-1B. They also need to do a final evaluation just to kind of close out their STEM extension and their F1 status. So that's, again, another requirement on the STEM extension of employers. Any questions? Another friend with a STEM EAD card, so very similar, basically the same thing as the OPT EAD card. Difference being, obviously, it's issued for 2 years as opposed to the 1 year. And the category is CO3C, STEM OPT. So again, under terms and conditions, that information, student, STEM OPT, verified employer, doesn't always show up. But it's not a concern. All right, J1 work authorizations. Does anyone have any questions about F1 work authorizations before we move on to J1?
Just to like recap then, between CPT, OPT, and STEM extensions, like what do you see as like a common path for students? Is it like CPT in the summers until they graduate, then OPT, or?
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of depends on the student and their program and, you know, what the program will allow, especially with the CPT. But yeah, that is pretty common, I'd say, especially for bachelor's students. Like they study for a year, do a couple of internships in the summers, graduate, do some OPT, do some STEM, get an H-1B. It's, if not a common path, a desirable path for a lot of students. So yeah, that's pretty common. We do also have some students who will do like, you know, semester-long co-ops or things like that, using their CPT before they graduate. Some students don't use any CPT and we don't see them until they apply for their OPT. It's also fine. That happens quite a bit, I'd say. Yeah, it really depends on the student and the program. But yeah, that's certainly not unheard of.
I might be jumping ahead, sorry. Do you know if completing the STEM extension has any bearing on the outcome of H-1B for the student later on?
I don't have any data on that, and I wouldn't want, like, it shouldn't have any bearing as long as, you know, a student has met the requirements and worked within the regulations that govern the work authorization, the STEM extension work authorization. So it really shouldn't have a bearing, but yeah, again,
So the STEM extension is not like lottery based or anything like that. So, are there chances for the USCIS to reject your application, and what are the like things that affect that?
good question. So OPT and STEM, neither of them are lottery based. So basically, as long as you know a student completes the application properly and submits it in a timely fashion, it should be approved. Rejections typically come if the student has not done things right. It's usually they forgot to sign their I-20, they forgot to sign their I-765, so the application for work authorization, they sent in the wrong filing fee, or they applied too early or too late. So it's all, you know, mistakes on the part of the student for the most part. We've had, in the 9 years I've been here, we've had a couple where they were erroneously rejected or denied, but those are not common. Okay, so we'll move on to J1. I won't spend too much time just because there's not a whole lot of students and it's unlikely you'll see, like, as soon as I say that, there's gonna be like 20 that walk in the door, right? But here we go. So J1 on-campus work authorization in Research Park is an interesting beast because prior to February of 2020, Research Park was technically not owned by the university, so it was not considered on premises. And for J1 employment to be considered on premises, or sorry, for J1 employment to be on campus, it must be physically in a university building. As of February of 2020, this belongs to the university, and so students in J1 status can work in Research Park as on-campus employment. The same restrictions apply as for Fs, that total employment can't exceed 20 hours per week, it can exceed 20 hours per week during official school breaks, all of that. Important to note, the difference is that J1 students cannot start work on campus any earlier than the start date on their DS 2019, and they do need to have prior authorization from ISSS, which takes 5 business days, in order to start working. That will come in the form of a J1 work authorization letter. It's on official letterhead that says J1 work authorization letter, so it's pretty easy to identify. There's no additional paperwork by the employer that needs to be done. And this, just like on-campus employment for F1s, does make a student eligible to apply for a social security number. And for that, you want to give the student an offer letter, but beyond the offer letter for applying for the SSN, there's really no additional paperwork on the employer side. On the student side, there's that one extra letter that they need to get before they start work. So that's on campus for J1s. J1 academic training. So whereas for F1 students, they have CPT and OPT for during and after their program, J1s have one large authorization that covers both called academic training, which is again temporary off-campus work authorization that students can use either during or after their program. It's authorized by our office, so our F1 students are usually jealous of our J1 students around OPT application time because our J1 students are getting their academic training approved in a week, and our F1 students are waiting 3 months. Academic training, the duration is 18 months, or duration program, whichever is shorter. So if you have exchange students, for example, who are here for 4 months, they'll be eligible for 4 months of academic training. PhD students in J1 status are eligible for an additional 18 months of academic training upon completion of the PhD, and we mark completion as the deposit of their thesis or dissertation. Another thing to note about academic training is that it can start immediately. So unlike CPT and OPT, there's no 1-year waiting period. I had a student one time who came into my office a week after he started his master's. He was like, I want to do academic training. I said, great. And so he just did it simultaneously along with his program, and that's absolutely fine for academic training. Just left him with very little time after he graduated to keep going. A few notes. The work on academic training, just like CPT and OPT, has to be directly related to the student's field of study. And it does require a letter from their academic advisor in order to apply for the academic training. And that letter, the details that need to be included are available on our website. There's a lot of them, and they're all Department of State requirements, so we do have to be rather picky about them. And that letter is required for every different academic training authorization that a student requests. So each employer would require a different authorization, a different letter, a new DS 2019 from our office. Employer requirements, pretty easy. No additional employer requirements with the exception of the offer letter, which in some cases academic advisors will require, but our office does not require, and is not required by regulations. It just will make the letter writing easier for academic advisors. This is a sample DS 2019, which again, you can see the program dates listed. I mean, you can't see them because it's far too small, but where they're listed. On the opposite side are the academic training dates and the employer name, just kind of over to the side next to the funding information. And then down at the bottom, you'll see what's called a 2-1-2-year home residency requirement notation. Just briefly, the 2-year home residency requirement It's sometimes a part of the J1 status, basically to prevent brain drain from certain countries for certain fields of study. So if a student is subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, it means before they apply for any dual intent or immigrant intent visa, they need to go home and complete 2 years in their home country, going back to their home country, or get that requirement waived, which oftentimes will require paying back like some government funding, things like that. But it is, in a lot of cases, possible to get that waiver. But again, they would have to either get it waived or complete the 2 years before they're eligible to apply for like an H-1B or a green card, or a K-1 visa or an L-1 visa. Not all J-1 students are subject to this. It's by country and by field, and there is a list. It's called the Exchange Visitors Skills List, and you can find it online. I think the most recent version is from 2009, so if you see that, like, don't freak out, because that's the last time they updated it. So yeah, so that's academic training. That's all I've got. So if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, feel free. And like I said, I'll stay for a little bit after too if you have anything that you want to ask one-on-one. So thanks everyone.
I often hear students kind of putting the knowledge of their immigration needs on the employer, like, oh, can you sign up for a corporate relations contract, or asking them, when can I start? What education on all of this material would students be expected to have when they enroll at Illinois?
When they enroll at Illinois, I mean, it depends. So students who,
Can you repeat the question?
I was just asking that.
oh, sorry. So the question was, what information about these, so, sorry, let's back up. Students will often come to employers and ask for information about the things that we've discussed today, but what the question is, what information should they have, or what would they be expected to have upon coming to Illinois? The answer is, it depends. We have some students who will come into our office before they even start, and they're like, what about CPT? I'm like, you haven't even been accepted. So these are very industrious students. They want to know what lies ahead. Great. Some students come into our office and they're like, I had a job offer, at State Farm. What do I do? So, it really depends on the student, honestly. But if you do have students asking you specifically as employers for this information, please feel free to just send them back our way, because that should not, it doesn't need to be your responsibility to, this is for your information, to make sure that you know what your responsibilities are. But honestly, it's the student's responsibility and our responsibility as educators to let them know what they need to do. So please do not hesitate to just toss it back our way, because we'll be happy to guide them in the right direction.
I feel like you guys are doing a good job, because everything you covered, most of it, the students are coming and teaching me.
Okay.
I've heard all of this, so it's not a big surprise, so I feel like you guys are doing a very good job.
That's good to me, thank you. It doesn't feel like that every day, but